I walked into Sunday lunch expecting an apology. Instead, I found my husband sitting too close to my sister while my parents prepared a speech about forgiveness. The affair was not the deepest blow. It was the realization that they had already arranged a new life together and left me exactly one role in it. They expected tears and begging. They forgot I analyze contract risks for a living. Once I start looking, they have nowhere to hide. My name is Teresa Grant. I am 37 years old, and I am the Director of Contract Risk Review at Halcyon Contract Risk Group. My entire career is built on a single unwavering principle: people lie, but the paperwork never does. I spend my days parsing through hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon, searching for the microscopic fractures in a corporate deal before the entire structure collapses. I look at spreadsheets, addendums, and hidden clauses. I analyze risk. I live by data, by hard evidence, and by the undeniable truth of a paper trail. I am paid a very high salary to ensure my clients are never caught off guard. Yet, on a humid Sunday afternoon in late summer, driving my 7-year-old daughter to my childhood home in the quiet suburbs of Franklin, Tennessee, I completely failed to predict the catastrophic collapse of my own life. My parents, Denise and Malcolm Grant, had summoned me for what they casually referred to as a family lunch. My mother had called me the day prior, her voice carrying a strange, brittle tension that I initially brushed off as her usual anxiety over hosting. She had been incredibly specific about one detail I needed to bring Willa. My husband, Adrian Cole, had left the house early that morning, claiming he had a golf tee time with potential clients and would meet us straight at my parents' house. Adrian was a man who navigated the world on charm. He was meticulously polite, always knew exactly what to say, and wore his tailored suits like armor. I parked my car in the wide, familiar driveway. The neighborhood was painfully serene, the kind of place where lawns were manicured to the millimeter and scandals were kept strictly behind closed doors. Willa unbuckled her seatbelt, chattering happily about the apple pie my mother always baked. I held her small hand as we walked up the brick path. The moment I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped into the foyer, the air inside the house felt immediately wrong. It was thick, suffocating, heavily conditioned yet strangely airless. The usual sounds of a Sunday gathering, the clatter of pans, the low hum of the television in the den, my father's booming laugh were entirely absent. There was only a dense, heavily manufactured silence. I guided Willa toward the sunroom, handing her a box of crayons and a fresh coloring book. I told her I would be right back. Then, I turned and walked into the kitchen. They were all waiting for me. It looked less like a family gathering and more like a carefully staged tableau. Adrian was sitting on a tall stool at the marble kitchen island. Right next to him, sitting far too close for a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law, was Laurel. Laurel Grant is my younger sister. She is the kind of person who has floated through her entire existence bathed in the warm, forgiving glow of our parents' infinite patience. She is the golden child, the free spirit, the woman whose messes were always quietly swept under the rug before she even had to apologize. My eyes immediately snapped to a detail that felt like a loud siren in a silent room. Resting delicately against Laurel's left wrist was a thin, hammered gold bracelet. The light from the pendant lamps caught the metal, illuminating the distinct, custom-engraved clasp. It was the exact bracelet Adrian had purchased for me 2 months ago, a gift meant to commemorate our anniversary weekend. When I had asked him about it a week later, he had put on a flawless performance of distress, claiming he must have accidentally left it in the hotel room safe. Now, it was gleaming on my sister's skin. My brain, trained to flag anomalies, registered the data point. The pieces shifted. The picture began to form. I looked at the rest of the room. Adrian and Laurel were angled toward each other, their shoulders barely a fraction of an inch apart. It was a physical proximity that spoke of long-standing intimacy, completely unnatural for the setting. My mother, Denise, was standing by the sink. She was furiously scrubbing a spotless ceramic dish, her shoulders tight, absolutely refusing to look in my direction. My father, Malcolm, stood at the head of the island. His hands were placed flat on the granite countertop, his posture rigid. He was using his boardroom face. Malcolm cleared his throat. It was the sound he made right before announcing corporate layoffs or budget cuts. He used the exact tone of a man preparing to declare the most reasonable solution to an unfortunate administrative error. "Teresa," Malcolm said, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile kitchen. "Please, stand there for a moment. We wanted to handle this internally, as a unit. We did not want you hearing about this from anyone on the outside." Adrian finally looked up at me. His handsome face was arranged into a practiced mask of solemn regret. He folded his hands together on the counter. "Teresa," he began, his voice dropping an octave to convey a false sense of gravity. "Laurel and I have crossed a line. We did not intend for this to happen, but things got out of hand." He spoke as if he were reporting a minor accounting error. Beside him, Laurel did not flinch. She did not look ashamed. She reached up with her right hand and lightly touched the gold bracelet on her left wrist. "It was never a plan, Tess," Laurel said, using the childhood nickname I despised. Her voice dripped with that breathless, manufactured sincerity she always used when she needed a bailout. "It was just real feelings. We could not fight it." The sheer audacity of the script paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. I turned my gaze away from the two of them and looked directly at my mother. I waited for her to drop the dish towel. I waited for the matriarchal fury, the protective rage I assumed any mother would unleash upon a man who had shattered her eldest daughter's life. Denise finally set the dish down. She wiped her hands slowly. When she spoke, she aimed her eyes at my collarbone, avoiding my face entirely. "Teresa," she said, her voice thin, trembling, but laced with iron absolute. "You are a mother now. You have to think about the bigger picture. Do not make Willa grow up in a broken home over this. You need to keep this family together." She paused, taking a breath to steady her nerve. The stronger person is always the one who knows how to let things go. The words hit me not as a physical blow, but as a chilling, absolute confirmation of my reality. My father nodded in agreement, reinforcing the united front. They had known, and they had brought me here, instructed me to bring my 7-year-old daughter, to use her as an emotional hostage. I slowly looked around the room. I looked at the oak dining table visible in the adjacent room, the table where I had eaten thousands of meals, where I had done my childhood homework, where I had believed I was safe. I understood the geometry of this room perfectly. This was not a confession. This was not an apology. This was a heavily coordinated ambush. It was a mock trial designed to force my signature on a non-disclosure agreement of silence. They had already arranged a new reality for themselves. They had carved out a neat, tidy space for Adrian and Laurel, and they had reserved exactly one role for me, the obedient, enduring, silent woman who swallows her pride for the sake of the family image. They fully expected me to crack. They expected me to scream, to hurl insults, to throw a glass against the wall in a fit of hysterical, manageable female rage. Then, they expected me to tire myself out and accept the terms of my surrender. They completely forgot who I am. They forgot what I do for a living. I read the risk. I see the liability. And I never, ever negotiate with hostile parties who have already breached the contract. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw a plate or utter a single curse word. I simply turned my back on all of them. I walked into the sunroom. Willa was carefully shading in the tail of a stegosaurus with a bright green crayon. I reached down and picked up her small denim jacket. "Come on, sweetie," I said, my voice as calm and level as a flatline. "We are leaving." Willa looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But Grandma said we were having pie." "We are getting ice cream instead," I replied. I hoisted her up, settling her firmly onto my hip, her weight familiar and grounding. I walked back through the kitchen. 4 pairs of eyes tracked my movement. The silence was now deafening, heavy with their sudden, panicked realization that I was not playing my assigned part. Adrian shifted his weight, opening his mouth to speak. Laurel leaned closer to his arm. Denise took a sharp, shallow breath, and my father's boardroom mask slipped into genuine shock. I did not look at them. I did not give them a single word to use against me. I carried my daughter through the foyer, opened the heavy front door, and walked out of that house forever. The drive back to our house took exactly 22 minutes. I know this because I counted every single rotation of the digital clock on the dashboard, mentally translating the changing numbers into words to keep my brain from splintering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. 22 minutes of absolute silence from me, while Willa hummed a song she had learned in music class, staring out the window at the passing trees. We walked through our front door, and I did not collapse in the hallway. I did not slide down the wall and weep into my hands. I walked straight into the kitchen, placed Willa's backpack on the designated hook, and went directly to the stove. Routine is a heavily armored vehicle. You just have to climb inside, lock the doors, and let it drive you safely through the blast zone. I filled a stainless steel pot with water. I turned the burner to high. I pulled a block of salted butter from the refrigerator. Willa sat at the kitchen island, kicking her legs against the wooden panels, enthusiastically telling me about a science project involving the solar system. I nodded at all the right intervals. I smiled when she laughed. I boiled the pasta for exactly 9 minutes. I drained it, tossed it with the melting butter and a heavy pinch of salt, and set the ceramic bowl in front of her. She ate her favorite meal, blissfully unaware that the foundation of her entire world had just been sold for scrap by the people who were supposed to protect it. After dinner, we moved to the living room carpet. For 45 solid minutes, I sat cross-legged beside her, helping her peel the stubborn adhesive backing off tiny foil stars. We pressed them firmly onto the dark blue pages of her astronomy notebook. My hands did not shake as I smoothed down the edges of the stickers. My voice did not waver or crack when I explained to her how far away Jupiter was from the Earth. I was executing a flawless performance. I was playing the role of a mother whose reality had not just violently tilted off its axis. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, I walked her upstairs and tucked her into bed. I read her a chapter about a brave mouse exploring a massive castle, kissed her warm forehead, and closed her bedroom door until the latch clicked softly into place. The second that door closed, the performance concluded. I walked back downstairs. The house was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator compressor. I skipped the wine, ignored the urge to call anyone, and did what 15 years in risk review had trained me to do. I started an audit. Adrian always assumed my professional paranoia stopped at our front welcome mat. He believed that because I spent my days scrutinizing multi-million-dollar corporate mergers and complex vendor contracts, I would never bother to look closely at the mundane, everyday clutter of our domestic life. It was a fatal miscalculation on his part. I walked directly to the third drawer down on the left side of the kitchen counter. It was our designated junk drawer, the place where mail was haphazardly shoved when he promised he would sort through it over the weekend and never did. I pulled out the thick, disorganized stack of envelopes. I also retrieved his backup family iPad from the charging station in the hallway and grabbed my own work laptop from my leather briefcase. I carried it all to the dining room. I spread the items out across the large oak table, flipping on the single overhead chandelier. The light cast a harsh, interrogative glare over the surface, illuminating the evidence of my ruined marriage. I started with the physical mail, bank statements, credit card offers, utility bills, near the bottom of the pile. I found a formal notice from our primary mortgage lender. It was a confirmation document for a home equity line of credit, fully approved and recently opened against our shared property. I stared at the credit limit printed in bold black ink, $50,000. My heart turned to a block of ice in my chest. I had never discussed this with him, and I had certainly never signed a single piece of authorization paperwork for this massive line of credit. I pushed the paper aside and opened the iPad. We shared a basic cloud account for family purchases and calendar syncing. Adrian was meticulous about curating his public image, but he was incredibly arrogant and lazy about his digital footprint. He rarely bothered to log out of his personal applications on the shared device. I opened his email client, bypassing the primary inbox and navigating straight to the deleted folder, and then down into the archived travel receipts folder. There they were, sitting in plain sight. Hotel booking confirmations. A boutique luxury resort in Asheville booked for the second weekend of October. A secluded, high-end cabin in the Smoky Mountains reserved for the first week of November. I stared at the nightly rates, $450 a night. The dates lined up perfectly with the exact weekends Adrian had claimed he desperately needed to travel out of state for emergency client damage control. I pulled out my phone and loaded Laurel's public photography page. I scrolled back. On the second weekend of October, she had posted a scenic, misty shot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, captioning it as a weekend location scout for a very special, private client. The location tags on her photographs matched the zip codes of Adrian's hotel confirmations flawlessly. But sex is cheap, and physical betrayal is common. What I was looking for was the structure behind their lie. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint banking secure portal. I navigated to Willa's college savings account. The total balance immediately looked wrong. I pulled up the transaction history. The monthly statements for the past 3 months were entirely missing from the physical mail pile. And now I saw precisely why. There had been steady, methodical cash withdrawals moving out of her education fund. I clicked back over to our primary checking account. I scrolled backward through the ledger to the third week of July. That was the specific week Adrian had sat on the edge of our bed, rubbed his temples in feigned exhaustion, and told me that his firm's quarterly bonuses were heavily delayed. He had suggested we needed to tighten our belts and postpone our planned summer trip to the coast to be financially responsible. Right there on the screen, dated that exact Tuesday, was a massive outgoing wire transfer, $12,500. The recipient was listed clearly as Lark Studio LLC. The memo line simply read, Brand Consulting. Lark Studio LLC was the boutique photography business my sister had suddenly and triumphantly launched 6 months ago, miraculously funded despite her chronic, lifelong inability to hold down a stable job or save a single paycheck. I leaned back in the dining chair. The cold, conditioned air of the house settled deeply over my skin. I began rapidly connecting the data points in my mind, drawing the undeniable vectors of financial fraud. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was not a passionate mistake born out of close proximity. They were not just sleeping together behind my back. They were actively siphoning my assets, my excellent credit score, and my daughter's future security to capitalize their new life. They were using my steady income and my blind trust to fund their escape velocity. I picked up the iPad one last time and opened Adrian's synced calendar app. I scrolled past his endless work meetings and his weekend golf games. I noticed new, color-coded entries that had systematically appeared over the last 4 weeks. They were highly specific. Detailed notes regarding Willa's daily routine. School pickup at 3:15 in the afternoon. Ballet class runs exactly 45 minutes. Pediatrician appointment at 4:30. Remember to ask Dr. Evans about seasonal allergy medication. Adrian had never taken Willa to the pediatrician a single time in her entire life. He had picked her up from elementary school exactly twice in the last 2 years, both times complaining about the traffic in the car line. Yet, here he was, meticulously logging every detail of her schedule. He was not suddenly trying to be a more present, better father. He was building a legal dossier. He was gathering the necessary data points to eventually walk into a family courtroom and present himself as the actively involved, hyper-stable primary parent. He was carefully preparing to argue for full custody, undoubtedly backed by the wholesome, traditional support system of my own parents, who had clearly already pledged their total allegiance to his and Laurel's new, fabricated narrative. I closed the calendar app. I stacked the physical mail back into a neat, identical pile and returned it to the drawer. I shut my laptop down. I sat alone in the dark kitchen for a very long time, listening to the silence of my stolen life. I felt the phantom weight of that engraved gold bracelet resting on Laurel's wrist. I heard my mother's thin, demanding voice insisting I swallow my dignity to keep their twisted version of peace. I saw the digital bank transfers that proved my husband had meticulously priced out my worth and decided to spend it entirely on my sister. They thought I was just a domestic wife they could easily manage. They thought my grief would blind me, that I would be too busy crying on the floor over a broken heart to notice the missing funds, the secret accounts, and the forged signatures. They wanted a weeping, chaotic, hysterical woman they could easily dismiss, label as unstable, and legally outmaneuver in court. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the cold air of the kitchen. My heart was breaking, but my mind was suddenly clear. I decided right then, sitting in the absolute quiet of the home they were trying to steal from me, that the only thing they would ever see from me moving forward was not emotion. I would not give them a single tear. I would not give them a single scream of anger. I would give them a masterclass in organized, total, and absolute consequences. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, I dropped Willa off at the elementary school drop-off zone. I watched her small backpack disappear through the double glass doors, waited until she was safely inside the building, and then I drove straight to downtown Nashville. I did not go to my office. I went to see Naomi Mercer. Naomi was a partner at a boutique family law firm that catered to high-net-worth individuals. She had a reputation that preceded her surgical, unsentimental, and notoriously ruinous to opposing counsel. I did not need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a mercenary. I sat across from her massive glass desk at exactly 9:15. I unzipped my leather tote and placed a thick, neatly tabbed binder onto the center of the table. Inside were the hard copies of every screenshot, bank statement, email thread, and transaction history I had compiled over the dark hours of the early morning. I handed over a silver flash drive containing the digital backups. Naomi opened the binder. She did not offer me a tissue. She flipped through the first 20 pages in complete silence, her eyes scanning the highlighted discrepancies. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of sharp, predatory approval. "The smartest thing you did was walking out of your parents' house without throwing a fit," Naomi said, her voice crisp and devoid of useless empathy. "If you had screamed, if you had slapped him, if you had broken a single piece of china, they would have filed a police report by 5 o'clock yesterday evening. They would have used your entirely justified anger to construct a narrative of severe emotional instability. You gave them absolutely nothing to work with." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the cool glass. "I need everything locked down, right now." "Consider it done," Naomi replied. She slid a legal pad toward herself and began writing rapidly. "First, we sever the financial bleed. You are going to leave this office, walk down to a completely new bank, and open an individual checking account. Reroute your direct deposit immediately. Then, you will contact the 3 major credit bureaus and place a hard freeze on your Social Security number. Change every single password to a randomly generated string of characters. Do not use your maiden name. Do not use your daughter's birthday." "I already initiated the password rotations at 3 in the morning," I told her. "Everything is secured on a detached external hard drive hidden in my office locker." Naomi offered a brief, satisfied nod. "Good. I am drafting a spoliation letter as we speak. We are going to serve it to your husband before noon. It legally mandates the preservation of all electronic evidence. If he deletes a single text message or shreds one credit card receipt after receiving it, the judge will hand us his head on a platter." She picked up her desk phone and dialed an internal extension. Within 10 minutes, a man named David joined us. He was the firm's in-house forensic accountant. He did not bother with pleasantries. He took the flash drive, plugged it into his laptop, and went to work at the small conference table in the corner of Naomi's office. It took David less than 4 hours to dismantle the financial illusion my husband had built. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the raw data had been transformed into a damning, heavily documented flowchart. "It is worse than a simple slush fund," David announced, turning his screen toward Naomi and me. "He has been routing capital from your joint checking and your daughter's education fund through a series of staggered transfers." I tracked the disbursements. The money went directly to a first month's rent and a massive security deposit for a luxury loft downtown. Another substantial wire was funneled into the commercial lease for your sister's photography business. He has also been pushing his personal luxury expenses, dinners, and hotel stays onto his corporate card, then reimbursing his company account using your shared liquid savings to hide the paper trail. Naomi tapped a silver pen against her chin. "He is highly leveraged, but it gets worse. Teresa, I ran a preliminary conflict check and pulled the local docket inquiries. Adrian did not just wake up yesterday and decide to confess. He consulted with a senior partner at a rival family law firm exactly 3 weeks ago." The air in the room grew thin. "He was pricing out a divorce," I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection. "He was pricing out a hostile takeover," Naomi corrected sharply. "He asked his counsel about the legal viability of maintaining the marital residence, keeping the child in her current school district, and heavily leveraging the maternal grandparents as a stable, established support network. He was planning to serve you with papers the moment his financial ducks were in a row. He wants primary custody. Teresa. He wants the house, the kid, and the built-in babysitters, while forcing you to pay him alimony based on your higher income bracket." I reached into my bag and pulled out a secondary, thinner folder. I slid it across the glass to Naomi. "That will not happen," I said. "Open it." Naomi opened the folder. Inside were the pediatrician access logs. Showing my login credentials were the only ones ever used to schedule appointments or message the doctor. There were hundreds of printed text threads between myself and Willa's teachers, room mothers, and ballet instructors. There were credit card receipts for every single grocery run, school supply purchase, and soccer cleat transaction from the past 3 years. I had included a meticulously color-coded spreadsheet documenting every weekend activity, birthday party, and sick day I had managed while Adrian was supposedly traveling or playing 18 holes of golf. "This is the structural reality of Willa's life," I explained, tapping the paper with my index finger. "He does not know the name of her homeroom teacher. He does not know she's allergic to synthetic red dye. I do the heavy lifting. I am the infrastructure." Naomi studied the documents, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. She closed the folder with a sharp snap. "I have handled hundreds of infidelity cases. This is not one of them. This is misappropriation of marital funds, suspected fraudulent execution of electronic signatures on a home equity line, and a highly premeditated, bad faith strategy to ambush a primary caregiver." She leaned across the desk, her eyes locking onto mine. The strategy was falling into place, interlocking like the gears of a massive, unstoppable machine. "We are not going to wait for him to make a move," Naomi declared. "We are going to dismantle his timeline before he has a chance to act. We are filing the petition for dissolution of marriage at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Simultaneously, we are filing an ex parte emergency motion for temporary sole physical custody, backed by the financial fraud evidence. I am submitting an immediate request for a total asset freeze on all accounts bearing his name. And finally, given the deeply compromised nature of your local support system, we are preparing a formal, legally aggressive petition for your lawful relocation." I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder. The suffocating weight that had tried to crush my chest the day before was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, bracing clarity of a finalized contract. I knew exactly what the terms of engagement were. "Draft the relocation papers," I told her. turning toward the door. "We are not staying in this town." The house was completely empty when I returned from my meeting with Naomi. Adrian had texted earlier, claiming a late afternoon strategic planning session would keep him at his corporate campus until at least 8 o'clock that night. He was lying, of course, but his absence provided the exact operational window I required. I did not go to the kitchen to prepare a meal. I walked directly down the hallway and pushed open the heavy oak door to his home office. The room smelled faintly of his expensive cedarwood cologne and old paper. Yesterday, this room was just part of my home. Today, it was the place where he had hidden the truth. I was not there to grieve. I was there to find evidence. I started systematically. I bypassed the obvious places and went straight for the structural blind spots. I checked the hidden compartment behind the printer paper tray. I went through the pockets of the winter coats hanging in the small office closet. Then, I knelt beside his heavy mahogany desk and pulled out the bottom right drawer. Beneath a thick, dusty stack of expired appliance warranties and old tax returns, my fingers brushed against a stiff manila folder. I pulled it out and opened it on the center of the desk. It was a printed copy of a residential lease agreement for a high-rise luxury apartment in the trendy Gulch district downtown. The monthly rent was listed at $4,500. The primary tenant was Adrian Cole, but that was not the detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. I flipped to the third page. There, sitting starkly under the guarantor section, was my name, my personal email address, and my electronically generated signature. I checked the timestamp next to the digital ink. It was executed on the 14th of May at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, matching the date and time to my mental calendar. On the 14th of May, at 2:15 in the afternoon, I was entirely off the grid, flying at 30,000 feet on a direct flight to Denver for a corporate risk assessment conference. He had waited until he knew I was unreachable in the air to fraudulently bypass the dual authentication security protocol and bind my financial standing to his secret residence. I set the lease aside and kept digging, deep inside a leather portfolio he rarely used. I found a crumpled, grease-stained paper delivery bag. Inside it was a printed receipt from a high-end, exclusive steakhouse in the city. The itemized list detailed 2 bottles of imported vintage wine, a pair of dry-aged ribeyes, and a decadent chocolate dessert. The total came to $420. The date on the receipt perfectly matched the Saturday of his supposed intensive industry seminar last month. I looked at the delivery address printed at the very bottom. It was not a hotel. It was the exact street address and unit number of Laurel's new loft studio. My hands moved mechanically, sorting through a secondary stack of folders tucked behind a row of hardcover books on his shelf. I pulled out a heavy document bound with a black plastic comb. It was the finalized commercial loan application for Lark Studio LLC, the exact paperwork my sister had used to secure her business space. I flipped past the asset declarations and the business plan summaries, heading straight for the final notarized pages. I went completely still, right there, on the thick white paper, under the section clearly labeled for independent witness verification, were 2 distinct signatures. One was a flowing, elegant cursive. The other was sharp, heavy, and architectural. They belonged to Denise and Malcolm Grant. My parents had not merely turned a blind eye. They had not just found out recently and decided to urge forgiveness. They had physically sat in a room, reviewed the legal framework of my sister's fraudulent enterprise, and signed their legal names to legitimize it. They had actively participated in the infrastructure of my destruction. I carefully placed every single document back exactly where I had found it. I took high-resolution photographs of every page, ensuring the timestamps and signatures were crystal clear, and uploaded them directly to the secure encrypted folder Naomi had established for me. Later that evening, the heavy, suffocating reality of their infiltration truly breached the walls of my home. Willa was sitting on the edge of the porcelain bathtub, swinging her bare legs while I brushed through her wet hair. She was happily recounting a story about a stray cat she had seen near the playground. Then, without any shift in tone, without any understanding of the absolute devastation her words carried. She looked up at me through the bathroom mirror. "Mommy, Aunt Laurel is so silly sometimes," Willa said, her voice light and musical. "Remember when she slept on the floor in Daddy's office?" My hand stopped mid-stroke. The plastic bristles of the brush caught in her damp hair. The bathroom suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I forced my facial muscles to remain entirely relaxed. I kept my voice perfectly even, injecting just the right amount of casual curiosity. "Oh, really?" I asked softly, resuming the brushing motion. "When was that, sweetie?" "A long time ago, when you went on the big airplane to Chicago for work," Willa replied innocently, kicking her heel against the tub. I woke up to get a glass of water, and she was in there with Daddy. She told me she had to stay super late to help him make a surprise birthday banner, but we never had a party. The tile floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. This was the second, infinitely more agonizing betrayal. The affair was not just a series of illicit hotel encounters or stolen afternoons in a rented apartment. It had crossed the threshold of my front door. It had crawled down the hallway where my daughter slept. They had brought their deceit into the very sanctuary I worked endlessly to secure. Polluting the air Willa breathed, I did not press her for more details. I did not ask her what they were wearing or what time the clock read. I simply smiled, kissed the top of her damp head, and told her it was time to put on her favorite pajamas. The moment Willa was asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and typed out a precise, clinical text message to Naomi, detailing the exact quote. Her response arrived less than 2 minutes later. "Open a blank document. Type the exact date, the time of the conversation, and her quote word for word. Do not add any emotional commentary. Do not ask her any follow-up questions tomorrow. We are recording this as a contemporaneous timestamp to prove the timeline of their reckless exposure. But we will not turn your child into a hostile witness. Protect her peace." I did exactly as instructed. I typed the note, saved it, and closed the laptop, sitting alone in the master bedroom, staring at the perfectly made bed I had shared with Adrian for nearly a decade. A profound and permanent shift occurred within my mind. Until this exact evening, a microscopic, deeply buried part of my subconscious might have still been reeling, still wondering how a family navigates the catastrophic fallout of infidelity. But Willa's innocent words had eradicated any lingering gray area. They had turned my daughter's safe haven into a theater of lies. They had made her a pawn in their grotesque domestic fantasy. I realized with absolute, chilling certainty that there was no longer a decision to be made between forgiveness and divorce. Those concepts were entirely irrelevant now. They had declared war inside my home. From that moment on, I was not just leaving a marriage. I was ending every structure they had built around my life. Exactly 6 months prior to the catastrophic Sunday lunch, the senior partners at Halcyon Contract Risk Group had offered me a highly lucrative lateral transfer. They wanted me to head a newly formed regional division based out of their rapidly expanding Cincinnati office. I had brought the proposal home to Adrian, laying out the 20% increase in base salary and the robust corporate relocation package. He had immediately deployed a masterful display of manufactured guilt. He had wrapped his arms around me, kissed my temple, and softly insisted that our roots were deeply embedded in Tennessee. He had argued that uprooting Willa would completely destroy her social rhythm and disrupt the stable, loving ecosystem my parents provided. Like an absolute fool, I had declined the promotion to protect the very people who were actively dismantling my life. I sat in my sterile office on Tuesday morning, staring at the muted skyline of Nashville, and picked up my desk phone. I dialed the direct extension of the regional vice president. I did not offer a sob story or an emotional plea. I offered my operational metrics. I reminded him of the multi-million-dollar liabilities I had successfully mitigated over the past 4 years. I simply asked if the regional director position, or anything reasonably comparable, was still actively on the table. Corporate memory is notoriously short, but corporate greed is incredibly reliable. A senior team lead position had just opened up. My historical performance data was flawless, and they needed someone who could start immediately. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, a formal offer letter was sitting in my encrypted inbox. The base salary was actually 15% higher than the initial offer from 6 months ago, bolstered by an aggressive, immediate signing bonus. I forwarded the document directly to Naomi. When I called her 10 minutes later, I could practically hear the predatory grin in her voice. She declared this the absolute pivot point of our entire legal strategy. We were no longer just playing defense against Adrian's premeditated custody ambush. We were launching a preemptive, geographical strike, a significantly better job, a massive increase in independent, verifiable income, and a brand new city completely scrubbed clean of my parents' toxic, enabling influence. Naomi explained that the family court system prioritized the overarching best interest of the child above all else, moving Willa away from an active epicenter of emotional deception and financial fraud into a structurally superior environment fully funded and managed by her primary caregiver, would make our relocation petition nearly bulletproof. I did not wait for the digital ink to dry on the offer letter before executing the next phase. I spent my lunch hour conducting a hyper-focused, targeted search of the Cincinnati real estate market. I bypassed the luxury downtown condos and focused strictly on quiet, family-oriented suburbs with exceptional educational metrics. Within 2 hours, I located a pristine, 3-bedroom craftsman-style rental house. It featured a fully fenced backyard shaded by mature oak trees, perfect for a 7-year-old to play safely. More importantly, it was situated exactly 2 blocks away from an elementary school boasting the highest possible state academic ratings. I bypassed the standard application queue entirely by offering to pay the first 6 months of rent up front in cash, drawing directly from the new, legally isolated bank account I had opened the day before. I signed the binding lease agreement by 4 in the afternoon. Every single contract, every wire receipt, and every email confirmation was immediately categorized and routed directly into Naomi's heavily fortified legal server to be weaponized for the court file. We did not give Adrian the luxury of a slow, dawning realization. We moved quickly, filing everything at once before Adrian had time to respond, exactly 48 hours after I walked out of my parents' kitchen. The paperwork was filed simultaneously across multiple county and state channels. The petition for the dissolution of marriage, the emergency ex parte motion for temporary sole physical custody, the aggressively documented request for an immediate, total freeze on all contested marital assets, and the comprehensive relocation petition hit the court docket in a unified, devastating wave. We deliberately overloaded the system, ensuring Adrian would have absolutely no time, no financial liquidity, and no legal breathing room to construct a coherent counter-narrative. The delivery of the documents was flawlessly choreographed. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, a uniformed process server walked past the confused receptionist at Adrian's corporate headquarters, bypassed building security, and handed him a massive, terrifyingly thick stack of legal documents right in the middle of a glass-walled executive conference room. At the exact same minute, across town, another server knocked on the frosted glass door of Lark's studio, handing Laurel a formal notice of deep financial investigation regarding her fraudulent commercial lease and the deliberate misappropriation of my daughter's education funds. Meanwhile, a bonded courier arrived at the manicured front porch of my childhood home in Franklin, delivering thick, certified envelopes to Denise and Malcolm Grant, officially putting them on notice that they were being formally subpoenaed as hostile witnesses in an active financial fraud and custody dispute. By noon, my personal cell phone would not stop ringing. The notifications flooded the screen in a rapid, desperate cascade. There were dozens of missed calls from Adrian. There were frantic, chaotic text messages from Laurel, fluctuating wildly between demanding I stop ruining her life and pleading for us to just sit down and talk like adults. My mother sent a massive, rambling paragraph accusing me of overreacting, insisting that a truly strong woman would never tear her family apart over a simple mistake, and aggressively reminding me that Laurel was my own flesh and blood. I read every single message. I screenshotted and archived them all for Naomi to add to the harassment log. What struck me most was what none of them said in their panic. Out of 43 text messages and 19 frantic voicemails from the people who loudly claimed to be the loving foundation of our family, not a single one of them asked how Willa was doing. Not one. They were entirely, selfishly consumed by the sudden, violent collapse of their own comfort and the exposure of their lies. I ignored everyone, letting the absolute silence amplify their terror. I only broke that silence once. At 3 p.m, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my father. I stared at his name on the glowing screen for 3 long rings before finally pressing the green accept button. I did not say hello. "Teresa!" Malcolm barked, his voice completely stripped of its usual condescending boardroom authority, replaced by a raw, vibrating panic. "You need to call off these lawyers right now. You are completely destroying your sister's business. You are ruining her future." I sat back in my leather office chair. I looked out the window at the city I was about to leave behind forever. Feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past few days finally begin to lift from my shoulders. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm enough to surprise even me. "No," I replied smoothly, the single word sharp and clean as a scalpel. "I am just no longer funding it." I ended the call. I powered down the phone, placed it in my desk drawer, and went back to work. Adrian walked through the front door at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The heavy thud of his leather briefcase hitting the hardwood floor signaled his arrival. He stepped into the living room, rolling his shoulders, his face perfectly arranged into a mask of weary, patient suffering. He had clearly rehearsed his lines on the drive over. He expected to find me pacing the floorboards, clutching a damp tissue, desperate to negotiate the terms of our ruined marriage. He anticipated a messy, hysterical wife he could soothe with empty promises and weaponized guilt. Instead, he found the living room stripped of all my personal effects. The scent of my perfume was gone. The decorative throws I had bought were packed, and resting precisely in the center of the glass coffee table was a perfectly aligned stack of legal filings, held together by a heavy black binder clip. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from the table to the hallway. He saw the open door to our master bedroom. Inside, my half of the walk-in closet was completely bare. The wooden hangers swung empty, clicking softly against each other. "What is this?" Adrian demanded, his practiced calm fracturing instantly. The velvet tone vanished, replaced by the sharp, grating pitch of a man losing control of his narrative. I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded softly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. "Those are your copies," I stated evenly. He marched over to the table and snatched the top document. His eyes scanned the bold legal header. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. "A temporary physical custody order, a relocation petition. Are you completely out of your mind?" "Teresa." He threw the paper back onto the glass. "You cannot just pack up your bags, grab my kid, and run away. I will have the police drag you back here before midnight." I reached forward and slid the second document toward him. It was the injunction. "Read the second page. Paragraph 4, I instructed, my voice as hard and clear as diamond. "You are legally barred from removing Willa from her current school district, and as of 3 hours ago, a judge granted my emergency motion for temporary sole physical custody based on documented financial misconduct. Your visitation is restricted to supervised, highly scheduled windows. You do not have the authority to call the police. You only have the authority to comply." Before he could formulate a counterattack, the front door swung open again. Laurel walked in without knocking, carrying a canvas tote bag as if she were simply arriving for a casual weekend brunch. She froze when she saw the tension in the room, but her shock quickly morphed into a bizarre, defensive defiance. She crossed the room and stood right next to him, her shoulder brushing his. "We knew you would pull something vindictive like this," Laurel said, lifting her chin. She actually smiled, a tragic, theatrical expression of relief. "But honestly, Teresa, I am just glad it is out in the open. Adrian and I finally do not have to pretend anymore. We can just be honest." The sheer, unadulterated delusion in her statement hung in the air. She genuinely believed that the moment they were caught stealing my life, their deceit magically transformed into a brave, romantic truth. I did not even grant her the dignity of a response. My silence rattled her more than any insult could have. Right on cue, as if summoned by the collective panic in the room, Adrian's cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass table. At the exact same moment, Laurel's phone chimed from inside her tote bag, and then, my own phone lit up with an incoming video call. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I picked up my phone and accepted the video call, propping it against a book on the table so they could all see the screen. Denise's face appeared, her lips pursed in tight, furious disapproval. "Teresa," my mother snapped, her voice vibrating through the tiny speaker. "I just received the most ridiculous package from a courier. You are dragging your own parents into a courtroom. You listen to me right now. Willa needs a healthy extended family. She needs her grandparents, and she needs her father. You are acting entirely out of spite, and you are destroying this family's foundation." It was a spectacular display of toxic irony. She was preaching about a healthy family dynamic on the very day the legal system was dismantling the abusive structure she had helped build. Before I could address her, Adrian let out a sharp, breathless curse. He was staring at his phone screen, his thumb scrolling frantically. He tapped an application, waited a second, and then tapped another. "My accounts," he choked out, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "My checking account is locked. The corporate expense line is frozen." Laurel pulled her phone out, her face mirroring his sudden panic. "Adrian, the studio account is showing a 0 available balance. The bank sent an automated alert about an active fraud investigation. The asset freeze had finally taken effect. The asset freeze we had filed that morning had successfully executed across the banking networks. The capital they had stolen to fund their secret apartment, the fraudulent business loans, the redirected education funds, all of it was clamped shut by a federal judge's signature. They were financially paralyzed. "You vindictive bitch," Adrian hissed, stepping toward me. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides. The polished corporate executive was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. "You think you can just freeze me out of my own life? I talked to my lawyers weeks ago. I know my rights. I was going to keep Willa here. Your own parents agreed with me. Malcolm and Denise both said I provided a more stable home environment, because everyone knows Teresa is always busier with her career than her own family." The room went silent. Even my mother, staring out from the video screen, clamped her mouth shut. He had just said the one thing he could not take back. In his blind, financially terrified rage, he had accidentally confessed to the darkest truth of their entire operation. This was never just a pathetic affair between a husband and a sister-in-law. It was a highly calculated, fully endorsed replacement strategy. They had looked at my life, decided I was too focused on providing the financial stability they were secretly draining, and concluded I was obsolete. The plan was to surgically remove me, slide Laurel into my empty space, allow my parents to assume the role of the primary moral authority, and completely absorb my daughter into their sick, twisted ecosystem. I looked at Adrian. I looked at Laurel, who was suddenly refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at my mother's frozen face on the glowing screen. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just a cold, sterile void where my love for them used to reside. I did not argue. I did not defend my dedication as a mother. I simply reached over and tapped the red button, terminating my mother's video call mid-breath. I stood up and smoothed the front of my wool trousers. I picked up my leather purse from the floor. Willa is already at her friend Juniper's house, I said, my voice clear and steady in the silence. She has been there since 3 o'clock. My lawyer will contact your counsel regarding the logistics of your supervised visitation, once you can afford to retain one. Adrian opened his mouth to shout, but no words came out. The reality of his complete powerlessness had finally anchored itself to his bones. I walked past them, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I stepped out onto the front porch. The evening air was cool and crisp. I pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, inserted my key into the deadbolt, and turned it until it clicked with absolute finality. I slid the key off my ring and dropped it into the ceramic planter by the welcome mat. I walked down the driveway to my car. I was not just leaving a house. I was permanently exiting the entire rotting structure they had built around me. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror a single time. The first 3 weeks in Cincinnati did not resemble the triumphant, healing montage of a cinematic escape. Survival is rarely that photogenic. The reality of uprooting a child's entire existence and planting it in foreign soil was exhausting, messy, and profoundly unglamorous. There were nights when Willa would wake up at 2 a.m, disoriented by the unfamiliar shadows cast by the mature oak trees outside her new bedroom window. She would cry for the particular creak of the floorboards in her old room. More painfully, she would sit at the kitchen island, staring at my phone, and ask why her grandparents had not bothered to dial our new 10-digit number. I did not have the luxury of falling apart, nor did I have the desire to poison her memories prematurely. I would simply stroke her hair, pour her a glass of warm milk, and explain in a calm, neutral tone that adults sometimes needed a very long time out to learn how to treat each other with respect. I spent my evenings unpacking cardboard boxes, learning the grid of the new city streets, and establishing a rigid, comforting routine that left absolutely no empty space for anxiety to bloom. At the new Halcyon corporate office, I threw myself into my role as the Regional Director of Risk Control for Civil Infrastructure Projects. My workload was substantially heavier, often demanding 50 to 60 hours a week. But the environment was entirely meritocratic and blissfully detached from my personal ruin. I was managing multi-million-dollar contracts, hunting down liability clauses in municipal construction agreements, and insulating my firm from catastrophic financial exposure. Within the first 45 days, I flagged a critical compliance failure in a massive city transit contract, saving the division from a devastating penalty. My new colleagues quickly learned that I was the exact person you wanted at the table right before a crisis detonated. I was efficient, unshakable, and surgically precise. Slowly, the frantic, jagged edges of our daily life began to smooth out. Willa met a little girl named Juniper who lived exactly 3 houses down the street. They bonded instantly over a shared fascination with collecting uniquely shaped rocks in the backyard. I signed Willa up for the local under-8 youth soccer league, trading my tailored blazers for heavy fleece pullovers on crisp Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Our world had shrunk dramatically. It was just the 2 of us now, operating without the sprawling, suffocating network of my parents and my ex-husband. But for the very first time in my life, the air inside my home felt incredibly clean. The contrast between our quiet reconstruction and the chaotic implosion back in Tennessee was stark. The family court judge had granted Adrian exactly 2 15-minute supervised video calls a week with Willa. During the first month, he missed 3 of them entirely. He would send a rushed, pathetic text message at 5 minutes past the hour, claiming a sudden executive meeting had trapped him at the office. I never argued. I simply logged the exact time of the missed call, documented his excuse, and added it to Naomi's growing evidentiary file. I watched Willa's initial disappointment gradually transform into a resilient, quiet acceptance. He was teaching her exactly who he was, and I did not have to say a single disparaging word to facilitate the lesson. Meanwhile, Laurel took her campaign of delusional martyrdom to the public square. through the periphery of mutual acquaintances. I learned she was posting long, melancholic essays on her social media platforms. She attached pictures of herself looking thoughtfully out of windows, accompanied by paragraphs dripping with pseudo-spiritual rhetoric about the agonizing pain of a family trying to heal, and the tragedy of a woman who chose bitterness over grace. She was aggressively positioning herself as the collateral damage of my supposed lack of forgiveness. I did not take the bait. I did not publish a single public rebuttal. I did not post cryptic quotes, nor did I leak the fraudulent lease agreements or the damning bank transfers to our extended social circle. I maintained an absolute, ironclad radio silence. I knew that engaging with a liar only legitimizes their platform. Instead, I let the undeniable metrics of our new life speak on my behalf. I approached Willa's emotional recovery with the exact same meticulous documentation I applied to my corporate risk assessments. I established a network of professionals to monitor her transition. The records from her new pediatrician showed a healthy weight gain and the complete cessation of the nervous stomach aches she had complained about during her final months in Franklin. Her second-grade teacher sent home glowing weekly reports, noting that Willa was participating actively, making friends easily, and showing zero signs of behavioral distress. More importantly, the clinical notes from her new pediatric therapist painted a picture of a child rapidly shedding a toxic burden. The therapist documented that Willa's sleep cycles had fully regulated. She was less irritable, more expressive, and had begun talking enthusiastically about upcoming holidays and weekend trips. The data was irrefutable. I was not a bitter woman isolating a child out of spite. I was a protective mother successfully rehabilitating a child in a structurally superior, honest environment. As the autumn leaves began to turn, I found myself slowly integrating into the local parent community. I was cautious, guarding my privacy fiercely, but isolation was not the goal. I met a woman named Mara Ellison, a program coordinator at the neighborhood youth center. Mara had a sharp, observational intelligence and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately respected. During a particularly rainy Saturday morning soccer game, we found ourselves huddled under the same oversized golf umbrella. She did not ask invasive questions about where Willa's father was or why we had moved so suddenly. She simply offered me a thermos of hot coffee, made a dry joke about the referee's eyesight, and treated me like a normal human being. Mara became my first genuine connection in the city, a friend who understood that some doors are kept locked for a reason, and who respected the boundaries of the fortress I had built. We were establishing a rhythm that felt authentic and grounded. I was rebuilding my life with discipline, early mornings, hot meals, and unbroken promises. It was hard, continuous work, but it was real. Back in Tennessee, the people who had betrayed me were trapped in a completely different reality. They had successfully stolen the physical remnants of my old life, but they were discovering the exhausting cost of maintaining a stolen foundation. They had to wake up every single day and perform for each other. Adrian had to pretend he was a dedicated family man while his bank accounts remained frozen under federal scrutiny. Laurel had to play the role of the devoted, ethical partner while staring at the walls of a studio funded by fraudulent loans. Denise and Malcolm had to parade their new twisted family unit around their quiet suburban neighborhood, smiling tightly at the whispered gossip of their peers, desperately trying to convince the world that everything was perfectly fine. I did not have to perform anymore. I just had to live. And as I sat on my back porch one quiet Sunday morning, drinking my coffee and watching Willa chase falling leaves across the frost-covered grass, I realized the most profound victory was not just walking away. It was that I had completely stopped looking back. The legal discovery process is a brutal, methodical excavation of a shared life. When the formal exchange of documents began in early winter, Adrian instantly dropped his pathetic, remorseful facade. He went on the offensive. His newly retained legal counsel filed a counter-petition that read like a piece of aggressive, poorly written fiction. He demanded full ownership of our marital home in Franklin, claiming his emotional attachment to the property superseded my financial investment. He laid claim to 40% of my deferred corporate performance bonuses, arguing that his supposed supportive role at home had enabled my career trajectory. Most insultingly, he demanded alternating weekly custody of Willa, proposing a strict 50-50 split as if he had not spent the last 2 months consistently missing his scheduled 15-minute supervised video calls. His attorney, a man known for his aggressive obfuscation tactics, submitted a preliminary brief attempting to minimize the entire situation. He painted it as a standard, unfortunate marital mistake, heavily implying that my husband's temporary moral failing should not prejudice his inherent rights to his property or his child. They wanted to quarantine the affair, treating it as an isolated, emotionally driven incident completely disconnected from his fitness as a father or a financial partner. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war we were waging. They thought I was a scorned wife trying to punish a cheating husband through the family court system. I was a risk analyst dismembering a fraudulent enterprise. Naomi's forensic accountant, David, did not stop at the surface-level bank statements or the obvious credit card receipts. He began forensically reconstructing the past 18 months of Adrian's financial life, line by agonizing line, cross-referencing metadata with banking ledgers. What he found beneath the initial layer of stolen funds was a labyrinth of corporate embezzlement and familial collusion. Adrian had not just been paying for his romantic getaways with Laurel out of pocket. He had been running the luxury hotel stays, the expensive dinners, and the room service charges through his corporate expense account, officially classifying them as client entertainment and out-of-state site visits, when his company's accounting department began to quietly flag the unusually high entertainment expenditures in late summer. Adrian panicked. He needed liquid cash to cover the deficits and avoid an internal corporate audit that would cost him his lucrative job. That was the exact moment he began systematically bleeding Willa's education fund dry, cross-subsidizing his personal financial sinkhole to keep his professional life intact. The financial rot spread much further than my husband's accounts. David traced a series of recurring, staggered deposits made directly into the checking account Adrian and Laurel used to pay the rent on their downtown loft. Whenever Adrian's corporate grift fell short of the $4,500 due on the first of the month, a wire transfer would magically appear to bridge the gap. David traced the routing numbers back to a small, obscure property management entity called Grant Holdings Incorporated. It was a shell company my father, Malcolm, had set up over a decade ago for minor real estate investments. My father was not just a passive, disappointed patriarch offering reluctant emotional support to his youngest daughter. He was an active, silent investor in the destruction of my marriage. He had been quietly paying the rent on their secret life, funneling capital to keep their twisted household afloat. The digital subpoena yielded even darker truths. We compelled the extraction of their cellular data backups, pulling thousands of deleted text messages from the cloud storage servers. Sitting in Naomi's office on a Tuesday afternoon, I read a specific text thread between my mother and Laurel that made my blood run entirely cold. It was dated just 2 days before that disastrous Sunday lunch. My mother, Denise, had typed out explicit, stage-managed instructions for her youngest daughter. "You must stick to the timeline," she wrote. "If Teresa asks, you both swear this only started after Easter. Do not deviate from that script. If she starts looking backward into the winter months, she will ask questions about the gold jewelry and the mountain cabin trip. Keep the timeline short. Keep it focused on a recent lapse in judgment." My mother had actively coached my sister on how to commit perjury during our family intervention. She was acting as the director of their twisted theatrical performance, protecting the perpetrators while serving up her eldest daughter as the sacrificial lamb. But the absolute hardest blow, the discovery that nearly shattered my carefully maintained composure, came from a seemingly innocuous file buried deep in Adrian's deleted digital trash bin. It was a digital draft application for a high-yield, unsecured line of credit. The requested limit was substantial. As my eyes scanned the primary applicant information, a wave of profound, sickening horror washed over me. The name listed was not Adrian Cole, The date of birth was not his. The application was filled out using Willa's full legal name, her child tax profile data, and her highly sensitive, 9-digit Social Security number. The application had not been formally submitted to the lender, but the intention was undeniable and permanently etched into the metadata. In his desperate, spiraling attempt to secure enough capital to maintain his fabricated reality with my sister, my husband had actually drafted the paperwork to commit federal identity theft against his own 7-year-old daughter. He was fully prepared to mortgage her unblemished financial future to float his sinking ship. I stared at the printed application on Naomi's glass desk, my hands trembling violently for the first time in months. A dark, terrifying rage surged up from the very bottom of my stomach. It was the kind of rage that made it hard to sit still, hard to breathe, hard to remember that patience would hurt them more than impulse ever could. I wanted to release the documents to his employer, to my parents' country club, to the local district attorney, and watch them all get marched out in handcuffs. Naomi placed her hand firmly over mine, pressing the paper flat against the desk. Her eyes were sharp and unyielding. "We do not submit this into the preliminary discovery file," she commanded softly. "If we show them this hand right now, his lawyer will scramble. They will invent a narrative about a hacked computer or a clerical error. They will have time to pivot and prepare a defense. We keep this completely off the table. We hold the corporate embezzlement, your father's shell company transfers, the coached perjury texts, and the identity theft entirely in the dark. We save every single piece of this for the formal mediation and the evidentiary hearing. We let them walk into that room completely arrogant, believing they are fighting a simple, routine divorce over an unfortunate affair. And then, when they have no time left to reshape their story, we present everything at once." I slowly withdrew my hand from the table. I took a deep, jagged breath, forcing the violent surge of adrenaline back down into my chest. I locked the rage away in a tight, impenetrable box. This was the first time I truly felt the seduction of the darkness, the primal urge to lash out and inflict immediate, physical pain. But I had spent my entire adult life learning how systems break. I knew the fundamental truth of conflict. Anger is loud. Anger makes people scream, thrash, and lose their footing. Discipline, however, is entirely silent. Discipline is what makes the other side completely collapse. I nodded once at Naomi. We would wait. As the formal date for our court-ordered mediation finally approached, the manufactured solidarity of the family I had left behind began to visibly fracture. The pressure of the impending financial exposure was acting like a vice, squeezing their tightly constructed lies until the seams began to split. My inbox became a daily repository for my mother's escalating panic. Denise sent a barrage of emails, her tone shifting violently between maternal command and desperate pleading. She begged for just one conversation in the exact same room. She claimed we needed to heal, to look each other in the eye and remember who we were as a family unit. But I knew my mother better than anyone on earth. She did not want to apologize or repair the catastrophic damage. She simply wanted to physically corner me, to use the familiar, suffocating gravity of her disappointment to force me back into line. She needed to regain control of the narrative before a federal judge ripped it out of her hands entirely. I did not reply to a single message. I routed her email address directly to a designated legal folder and let the absolute silence amplify her terror. My sister's reaction to the approaching deadline was a masterclass in profound cognitive dissonance. In the public sphere, Laurel aggressively doubled down on her romantic delusion. She flooded her social media feeds with aggressively curated photographs of herself and Adrian looking blissfully happy at local coffee shops and outdoor markets, trying to sell our extended social circle on the tragic beauty of their forbidden love. Yet, simultaneously, her legal counsel reached out to Naomi with a deeply pathetic, unofficial request. Through her attorney, Laurel practically begged me to withdraw the aggressive forensic financial investigation into her photography studio. The justification attached to this request was so absurd it bordered on comedic. Her lawyer suggested that, out of basic feminist solidarity. Women should not destroy each other over a man. Laurel genuinely wanted to reframe her active participation in the embezzlement of my daughter's education funds as a simple romantic misstep, demanding sisterly immunity from the very woman whose life she had actively conspired to dismantle. I instructed Naomi to reject the request without a single word of explanation. Adrian, realizing that the financial guillotine was truly about to drop, abandoned his arrogant posture entirely. He attempted a backdoor negotiation to save himself. His lawyer contacted Naomi with a highly confidential settlement offer. Adrian was suddenly willing to surrender any claim to the marital apartment downtown and walk away from our shared assets. He offered to sign the divorce decree immediately, completely uncontested, and finalize the paperwork within a matter of days. It sounded like a total surrender, until you read the attached conditions. In exchange for his swift signature, I had to immediately halt all forensic accounting inquiries, permanently drop the subpoenas against my parents, and agree to an incredibly vague, flexible joint visitation arrangement. He was not trying to make amends. He was desperately trying to buy his way out of the blast radius. He knew that if the full extent of his corporate fraud and my father's shell company transfers saw the light of a courtroom, he would not just lose his wife, he would lose his career, his liberty, and his carefully curated reputation. Naomi and I rejected the offer within 5 minutes of receiving it. We were not going to settle for a quick exit when we had the leverage to expose the entire rotting foundation. While the adults frantically scrambled to protect their assets and their reputations, the most damning piece of evidence arrived quietly in a sealed manila envelope from Willa's pediatric therapist. During a routine play therapy session earlier that week, Willa had sat on a brightly colored rug, building a tower of wooden blocks, and casually delivered a profoundly heartbreaking observation. She told the doctor that she never wanted to visit her grandparents' house in Tennessee again, when the therapist gently asked her why. Willa simply stated that whenever she walked through the hallway or entered a room, everybody stopped talking and started whispering. It was a remarkably simple, childish observation, but it possessed the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute truth. The adults in that house were so consumed by their own dark secrets, so terrified of what the child might hear or repeat, that they had transformed my parents' home into an environment of thick, suffocating anxiety. The therapist's official, court-appointed evaluation was utterly unequivocal. The neutral clinical report concluded that Willa was responding beautifully to the stable, predictable, and transparent rhythm I had established in our new city. The doctor explicitly warned that forcing my daughter back into a highly secretive, tense, and fractured family network for mandated visitation would cause severe emotional regression. The environment was clinically deemed emotionally unsafe. The custody battle was effectively over before we even stepped into the mediation room. Their lies had not just destroyed my marriage, they had fundamentally disqualified them as a safe harbor for a child. The evening before the mediation, my house was perfectly quiet. Willa was fast asleep in her room. I was sitting at the dining table, methodically reviewing the physical evidence binders one final time, when my phone vibrated with an automated alert. It was a notification from a mutual acquaintance's social media page, highlighting a new public post from Laurel. I clicked the link. It was a beautifully shot, professional series of photographs that looked exactly like a formal engagement announcement. Laurel and Adrian were standing on the wooden deck of a beautiful rustic cabin overlooking a glassy, mist-covered lake. They were wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, smiling intimately at the camera lens. I recognized the location instantly. It was the exact same luxury lakeside cabin Adrian had claimed to visit for a high-level, mandatory executive strategy retreat early last spring. He had specifically asked me to pack his heavy winter coats and his waterproof boots for that trip. I had carefully folded his clothes, kissed him goodbye in our driveway, and wished him a highly productive weekend with his corporate colleagues. Instead, he had driven into the mountains to play house with my own sister. The timeline of their betrayal was significantly longer and far more entrenched than even my worst calculations had predicted. They had been laughing at me, spending my money, and planning my obsolescence for well over a year. A few months ago, seeing those images would have shattered my knees. I would have collapsed on the hardwood floor, weeping violently at the sheer cruelty of it all. But that night, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, my pulse did not even elevate. I did not shed a single, solitary tear. I simply connected my phone to the wireless printer, printed the entire series of photographs in high resolution, captured the digital timestamps, and neatly clipped them into the final section of my evidentiary binder as one last piece of proof. I walked upstairs, laid out Willa's school clothes for the following morning, and turned off the hallway light. I did not stay awake to grieve the family I had lost. I had finally learned something simpler than anger. The truth does its best work when you stop forcing it and let it arrive at the right moment. The mediation was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. It quickly transitioned from a standard negotiation into a binding evidentiary hearing. Adrian walked into the heavy mahogany room wearing his best-tailored navy suit. He carried himself with the sickeningly confident posture of a man who firmly believed I was still desperate for his validation. He thought I was sitting at that table waiting for a tearful apology, hoping to negotiate the emotional wreckage of our marriage. Laurel sat beside him, dressed in soft, muted tones, playing the tragic heroine who simply could not help falling in love with the wrong man. Behind them, my parents, Denise and Malcolm, sat rigidly in the gallery chairs. They had their chins tilted upward, broadcasting the absurd delusion that they still possessed the moral authority to teach their eldest daughter a lesson about family loyalty. Naomi did not even acknowledge their posturing. When the presiding mediator formally opened the floor, my attorney did not begin with the infidelity. She did not mention a broken heart or betrayed marital vows. She simply opened her heavy black binder and started with the money. Naomi laid out the luxury apartment lease, highlighting my forged electronic signature. She presented the chronological bank statements, showing the exact thousands of dollars drained from Willa's education fund. She traced the precise flow of capital moving directly into the commercial lease for Laurel's photography studio. Finally, she dropped the banking records, proving my father had systematically covered their financial shortfalls through his hidden property management entity. Adrian's attorney immediately tried to interrupt, stammering about administrative oversights and mutual marital assets. He attempted to brush the forgery off as a simple, sloppy misunderstanding between spouses. Naomi did not raise her voice. She simply turned to the next tab in her binder. She slid printed copies of my mother's text messages across the polished wood table. The room went dead silent as the mediator read Denise's explicit instructions directing Laurel to lie about the timeline of the affair. Right beside the text transcripts, Naomi placed the printed photographs of my sister and my husband at the mountain cabin from the previous year, matching the timestamp directly to Adrian's fake corporate retreat itinerary. She added the jewelry store receipt for the gold bracelet. My parents physically shrank into their leather chairs. The arrogant veneer melted off Adrian's face, replaced by a pale, clammy panic. But Naomi was not finished. The heaviest blow fell with perfect precision. Naomi produced the digital metadata proving Adrian had consulted a family law attorney to build a custody case weeks before the Sunday lunch ambush. Then, she presented the clinical timeline, demonstrating that he and Laurel had actively carried on their physical relationship inside my marital home, often using the home office, while my 7-year-old daughter was sleeping just down the hall. In less than 45 minutes, every single demand Adrian had arrogantly listed in his counterpetition completely collapsed. His request for shared custody, his demand for a portion of my corporate bonuses, and his claim to the old suburban house evaporated into the sterile air of the hearing room. The issue was no longer about a husband cheating on his wife. It was a highly documented presentation of severe financial fraud, premeditated deceit, and a fundamental threat to the psychological and environmental safety of a child. Then came the fracture. To secure the absolute asset freeze, Naomi casually submitted documentation regarding the pending internal audit at Adrian's corporate headquarters, triggered by his fraudulent expense reports. She paired it with a formal notice of severe, pending tax liabilities hanging directly over the photography studio. Business debts Laurel had absolutely no idea existed. For the first time in this entire ordeal, their united front shattered. Laurel turned to Adrian, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek as she realized he had lied to her about his financial solvency. Adrian snapped back, viciously blaming her expensive aesthetic demands for his corporate embezzlement. They stopped fighting me and began aggressively tearing each other apart right there in the conference room. It was a pathetic, ugly display of two parasites realizing the host was gone and they only had each other left to consume. The final resolution heavily and undeniably favored me. The presiding authority granted me primary physical custody and absolute, unilateral control over every single account associated with Willa. I received a heavily disproportionate share of the marital assets, plus a strict order for financial restitution to replenish the stolen funds. Adrian was stripped down to severely restricted, supervised visitation windows, contingent upon rigorous behavioral conditions. As for Denise and Malcolm, the ruling was brutally clear. The grandparents were granted absolutely zero default access rights. If they ever wanted to see Willa again, they would have to petition me directly, and I would never open that door. When the proceedings finally concluded, I did not stand up and deliver a triumphant speech. I did not turn around to look at my parents. I did not shoot Laurel a victorious glare or offer Adrian a parting insult. I simply packed my files into my leather briefcase, snapped the brass lock shut, and walked out of the building without a backward glance. I drove straight to Willa's new elementary school. I signed her out 20 minutes early and took her to get double scoops of chocolate ice cream. That evening, back in our quiet, safe home in Cincinnati, I stood on a stepladder in her bedroom and helped her hang a glowing map of the constellations on her wall. As I smoothed the edges of the poster and listened to my daughter hum, I finally understood revenge. It was never about making them suffer. It was about building a life so steady and complete that they no longer had any place in it. As I stood there with Willa, smoothing the last corner of the poster against her bedroom wall, I understood something simple and final peace was never going to come from making them suffer. It came from building a life so honest, so steady, and so far beyond their reach that they no longer had any place in it.